Hey guys, as you guys have seen, I've been uploading a lot of Air Tycoon videos recently, and that prompted me to want to kind of make a tutorial for this game. So how do you start off in this game? I started out just like anyone else a few months ago, and now I've managed to climb myself to the top of the pre-tax profit leaderboards, at least for the world I'm in, and I wanted to share with you guys the strategies, the 5 most important aspects of the strategies in this game that can result in a great result like this. Now, the first part about this game is picking a base, and it's by far the most important because your home base determines a lot of things about your country or about your airline. So my home base is London. So what does your London Heathrow, to be specific? So what does your home base determine? Well, your home base determines a lot of things. First of all, it determines where you can open another base. So for example, my home base is London, and it is 2008. So the EU is open, so that basically means I can open another base anywhere in the EU. If this game world were to be in 1950, I would only be able to open a base in the United Kingdom until the EU opens in 1997. Likewise, if I were to start in Algeria, for example, then I would be stuck in Algeria for the entire game because, Algeria never has some agreement like the EU for basically every country except for an EU country. You're stuck in that country forever. If you decide to start in India, you're an Indian company forever. If you start in Saudi Arabia, you are a Saudi Arabian company forever. So what this basically results in is the maximum size of your company is somewhat dependent on the size of the market that you have available to you. Now, I like to classify countries into the size of their market. So I'd put the US and the EU as by far the biggest markets, of course, with the US leading by far, and then the entire EU is probably second to the US by a little bit even. And then Japan as the third largest market. And I'll explain why Japan is so big in a second. But the reason why these are the biggest markets is both of these markets have certain cities which are high in cargo demand, which is very profitable in this game. And Japan, while has decent passenger demand, has some of the highest cargo demand in the entire world, which makes it a really big market, not quite as big as the EU or the US, but I would probably say the third biggest. Now, after that, there's what I would call the medium-sized markets. So you got Canada, Brazil, China. I guess you could probably consider Russia or just Russia. Maybe India, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa, Australia. These markets are kind of medium-sized. Maybe Mexico you could put in there too. And if you just start in one of these markets, you're probably gonna be among 1 or 2 very large airlines in this country. And if you can manage to make yourself the only large airline in one of these countries, you're going to be good off too. But I find it relatively difficult, in fact, because usually there'll be one really good player, experienced player, who is positioned in each one of these countries. And most of the time, as a newer player, you might not be able to grow into a bigger company than them. It might be easier, in my opinion, to start in one of the mega markets, such as the US or the EU, where there's so much demand in general. You'll be able to keep finding demand, at least niches in your demand in these 2 countries. Of course, my favorite for every airline simulator game is London Heathrow. But you could easily start in LAX. I think LAX is an even bigger hub because it has more cargo. Chicago, Atlanta, any of the New York airports except for I can't remember the one which doesn't have much demand. Dallas and Houston are both big. There's tons and tons and tons of airports in America which are big. Toronto's big. In Japan, basically any city you choose will have tons of cargo demand, so that's always a good option. And then the rest of the countries kind of feel like you will probably, if you choose this country, be the only large airline in that country, assuming you're starting from the beginning of the game. If you're not, you might have to work your way up to that point. So if you choose to start in, say, Uzbekistan, in Tashkent or whatever, there's probably going to be one big airline in Tashkent, and you're going to be battling over all the demand in these single countries, and basically one company will eventually go bankrupt, and you'll probably be the only one left there. I'd probably put Saudi Arabia as a medium-sized country too. Yes, so for example, if you start in Panama, you'll likely be only competing with one person until one of you go bankrupt. It might be a while before one does, but it probably will eventually happen. So, given that, what I recommend when starting is, do you want to become one of the, you need to think, do you want to become one of the biggest airlines around? Because if you do, you really have to pick in the either a EU, US, or Japanese market. You could probably make it out of China too, but likely you'll have to be battling one other very skilled player. Whereas in the EU or the US, you can probably carve out your own niche no matter where you choose to start. But I would highly recommend in the EU, London Heathrow, Frankfurt Main, Paris Charles de Gaulle, Madrid, Amsterdam Schiphol, one of those 5 airports, or Rome, are probably the best shots you're going to have at becoming a very, very large airline. Whereas in the US, LAX, Atlanta, or Chicago, either Newark or JFK in New York, Houston or Dallas, Phoenix, Denver, or Seattle, probably all good options, probably more which I missed. Or you can basically just start in any capital city in any of the smaller countries in the world, which will probably have demand, or one of the Australian cities or something like that. But so if you choose to start in a single small country, you will probably be the only big one, and you'll probably be able to grow into a very profitable and very good airlines. For example, if I go into the statistics in this world, the most profitable airline, I believe. Statistics is actually, or the highest profit margin is actually just the single large airline out of Saudi Arabia. He managed to bankrupt the other guy in Saudi Arabia, and now he's basically flying with 30% margin and making big bucks as a large to medium, very large, or like large to very large airline. Of course, my airline is very large as well. Same with the guy in South Africa. This is the South African airline. He managed to basically get rid of all other competition in South Africa and Johannesburg. So he is managing to soar as well, and he's just ridiculously profitable with his only 2 fleet types as well. So yeah, basically with picking your base, I would avoid some of the middle markets and go with either the biggest ones in the EU or the US, or pick your own country, unique country, Panama, something small like that, and you'll likely have a good time. Of course, you're still have to be active and stuff, but yeah. So the next most important thing, and this is the easiest to do, but very, very important, is only pick 3 different aircraft fleets. So what do I mean by that? All aircraft in this game are divided into fleets. So for example, here are all the fleet types. Now the most prominent ones are of course the ones by Boeing and the ones by Airbus. So for example, under the 777, under the 777 we have all these aircraft. Under the DC-10 fleet type, for example, or it covers everything from the DC-10 to the MD-11 and everything, and every type of MD-11 or DC-10 in between. For example, the 737NG is its own family, and you're going to basically only want to pick 3 and no more. Only pick airplanes from within those 3 fleet types and only operate those. And the reason is there's a mechanism in this game which deliberately increases your maintenance expenses a bit irrationally highly per aircraft once you add a new fleet type. So this penalty gets worse and worse the larger your fleet is, regardless of how many of each fleet type. So I could have 1 A320, 1 737, 1 767, and 1,000 757s, for example. and I would have 4 fleet types, and I'd be charged a ridiculous amount of maintenance, and I'd basically become unprofitable. And the reason that this penalty exists is simply to stop single airlines from dominating every market. For example, if you're the best player out of the United States and you could have infinite fleet types, you could operate a regional jet, a 737, even prop a really small prop plane like Saabs or Cessnas or something like that. I don't know, ATRs, all the way up to freaking 747. You can operate some of every single one, and you could basically fill the entire market and leave no room for anyone else. So, yep. And the next, so it's really simple. Just pick 3 fleet types. Don't go over no matter what. It's not too hard to do that, and you should be fine. Now, the next thing is also pretty simple, but maybe not so much, and that is simply find routes with not extreme oversupply. So, for example, a lot of the routes I service already do have extreme oversupply, but I won't want to keep adding. Whereas a route like this, where I could consider to add more supply, you know what I mean? Whereas if you are looking for routes and you see this shouldn't be your first route. Find a route where you have open demand first before you start to compete. Pretty simple. I don't think that's too much for anyone to handle. Now, so I've gone over fleet types, I've gone over routes, I've gone over starting a base. So what are the next 2 most important things? Well, the next most important thing is scheduling times. Now, scheduling times is a pretty interesting thing. If you're used to Air Tycoon Online or something like that, you might not care at all about scheduling times because it doesn't really exist as a thing. But in this game, you really want to spread out your scheduling times. For example, I have an 84% or something load factor on LAX, despite the oversupply margin being much larger than that. So, for example, on a day like this, there's 3,000 extra supply. I should have around 75% load factor with demand bars like this, but I have 84, which is outperforming how much you would think. And one of the main reasons for that is I've spread out all my departure times nearly perfectly. Ideally, you want to have every hour, but of course, for a route with as much demand as LAX, you cannot take off just once every hour because you can't add enough flights. So this is every half an hour. So yeah, as you can see, 1040, 1010, 1040. There's some messy parts, of course, but like 1240, 1310, it's almost regularly every half an hour you have a flight take off. Now, for 90% of routes in the world, there's not going to be this much demand, or probably much more than 90%. You're going to want to have at least an hour between schedules, preferably more. And the other important thing for scheduling times to keep into consideration is don't schedule passengers between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. So between midnight and 5 a.m. basically. Just avoid those times entirely, and times after 6 a.m. and before 11 p.m. are the best. So if you can do that, always make sure to do that. Additionally, for scheduling times, let me think if there's anything I have to say. No, I don't think there is. So the last oh yeah, there's some more. Actually, for cargo planes, times do not matter at all, and stopping over does not matter also. You can add up to 2 stops, I believe, for a cargo route, and the cargo route doesn't care about the time, so just good to consider. Well, that's 4 things, and the last thing is, of course, well, let's have fun. As long as you stay active, keep playing, and buying your aircraft, and stuff like that, it should be fine. Whether you buy, lease for a short time, lease for a long time, all of that really likely won't make a difference. I mean, it's best to lease used aircraft on the used market, and then buy your own new aircraft, but sometimes you can lease new aircraft too, and it's okay, especially if you have a market you're trying to fill. But anyways, the most important thing is to have fun. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.